profess an obsession about the hardscape or stone walls, you escape the obligation of weeding. And so far, I've been able to do that. Thank you for attending. Cindy Brockway is a nationally recognized authority on both the restoration of gardens and the preservation of gardens, public and private. She's authored 2 books. She's also authored numerous articles. Her work here at the Fells began roughly in 1992, at a time when then Governor Judd Gregg, by executive order, established what is known as the Hague Commission. One of the requisites of the Hague Commission was to have a garden expert to advise them, because their task was basically to advise the state, Fish and Wildlife, and local citizens of the future of our gardens, our grounds, and our buildings. Cindy's report, constituting some 50 pages, is entitled Cultural Landscape Policies and Philosophies. It incorporated a history of the Hay family, a history of the property, and it detailed essentially 9 major sections of the property. The gatehouse and surroundings, the pebble court and entrance garden, the old garden, known then as the Pan Garden, the orchard and the lawns, even the field and the tennis court, which years ago Clarence Hay built below where the veranda is. It no longer exists. She also dealt with vistas and views, including those views of Lake Sunapee, the perennial garden, the rose garden, and the alpine garden, sometimes referred to simply as the rock garden. Her report is replete with diagrams, descriptions, recommendations on each of these sections of our property. And her report was heralded and adopted by the Hay Commission, by Fish and Wildlife, by the state, by the Garden Conservancy, and by the Friends of the Fells. In short, her report put the Fells on the National Garden map. That report, in my judgment, was, is, and I think most likely always will be, the Garden Bible, our master plan. But as I indicated in the very beginning, she also has been involved in preservation of gardens. And in going back over the minutes of the Hay Commission, it was very apparent. She was the first person officially and formally to recommend that the commission look into the Hay property coming under the National Registry. That was in 1992. It took 8 years to get under the National Registry, but it was ultimately accomplished. And frankly, it took another 8 years for us to accomplish the purchase of the property itself. So her early work in both restoration and preservation is in many respects a very significant step towards what is our independence and the preservation of what is so beautiful and wonderful here and loved by everybody. I'd like to welcome now Cindy Brockway. Thank you.
After all of that introduction, it was a lot of trips between Kennebunk and Newburgh. I can tell you that for everything that we do. If I stand here, can you all see the screen behind me? Okay, perfect. Today what I'm going to do is a couple of things. I want to talk a little bit about how landscapes grow, mature, start to fade, start to die, get rejuvenated again, and watch that process go on. And I've been with this property long enough that I have a series of about 38 years of photographs that can show you some of those changes that happen space by space. So we're going to take a little garden tour in a little bit, but first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of these principles. I need to turn this on. There we go. This statement is something, back in 1988, I was pregnant with my son, my second child, and Stu Wallace was the State Historic Preservation Officer, and I'd been the Director of Landscapes at Strawberry Bank for a long time, went to work on my own, and I was in his office doing another project, and he said, you know, there's this big property that has this amazing rock garden to it. And I wonder if you might go over and take a look at it and see if we should play a role in commenting on it, because the Fish and Wildlife Service has just taken it over. So I went over and I advocated that yes, this was an important property, and did a little tiny history report for them, because at that point, the Preservation Office didn't really know much about historic landscapes and gardens. And so that's what started this whole conversation going. And over the years, it developed into a whole series of advocating for partnerships and for management and the Garden Conservancy and so on. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. But John Hay, the grandson, was very concerned that we not turn this property into something that was preserved like a fly in amber. He did not want that to happen. He said, my parents never allowed this place to be static. It was always evolving, it was always changing, and it's very important to me that we think about this incidental interaction between man and nature, because that is what this property is really, truly all about. And I've never been more grateful for a phrase from a lovely writer than that statement itself, because it's taken from here to a lot of the other projects that I've worked on over time, because people forget, we tend to silo ecology in one bucket, horticulture in another bucket, preservation in one bucket, and conservation in another bucket. And if we can begin to combine those into unified voices, that's really what the true genius of this place is really all about. So I credit that with John Hay for sure, and it has helped us in developing some of these phrases and some of this work that we did and all of that planning that's happened here. This is what happens with a designed landscape. So I'm going to show you some pictures of what this place looked like when John Hay, the original owner, was here. And it was a farm. He really thought about it as his farm. But if you think about any of the garden spaces that Clarence and Alice developed, they all start out with an idea and a new design. And that design grows and it matures. And then it begins to get older. The shrubs grow bigger, the plants start to die. We have one of those New Hampshire winters like last winter when you never quite know what's going to happen in the spring. And unless you have a gardener, so that maintenance cycle in the center is the gardener. Without the gardener, he or she can keep that going in that loop for as long as it needs to be. But if that person is no longer with us, then you see the garden begin to lose its integrity and it declines. And then it goes onto this space where the hardiest of plants are the only things that remain. And eventually, especially here in New Hampshire, the woods all grow in and it turns into a woodland with some remains of stone walls and foundations underneath it. And I know that you've all experienced places like that in any of your travels here in this state. This is what I call the aging process. I've dealt so much with boards and committees that don't understand historic preservation terms. So I say to them, think about any landscape as having a foundation, which is the part of the property that will be here for 150 years or more. Anything that's built out of stone or granite, all the work that Fritz loves to do, that is the foundational elements of any landscape because they survive for many, many generations. The framework are the trees and sometimes the buildings that might be here for 75 or 100 years before they start to decline and go away. And then the frosting are all of the things that are the most ephemeral parts of the landscape. And that includes the lawn, it includes the tenderest perennials, even the hardiest perennials eventually, unless they're a peony or a daylily, will disappear into the landscape. So if you think about those elements and how long they tend to survive, then the projection that Clarence Hay had when he was talking about the loss of his rock garden in 1962 when he wrote his article was that in fact, in this, you'll see some pictures of this middle layer, the ground layer along the ground with all the perennials, if you think about the rock garden or here where we are, this middle layer, so this hedge of yew that surrounds us all here, grows up. It's probably 4 times as big as it was when it was trimmed to be the kennel and the space for the dogs, the dog yard in here. You lose that spatial relationship. So everything starts to get a little bit fuzzy. And what happens here, and when you see some of the pictures of the old garden, with that middle ground grown up, you don't get that space between the canopy and the ground, and the light changes then. And so those beautiful images that you think about here at the property are because that slanting light when the sun goes down or the sun comes up is raking through that space between the canopy of the trees and the ground plane to be able to create some of these cathedral-like moments that we have here in New Hampshire. And so, and of course, invasive weeds come in no matter what you do. And then eventually you start to begin to lose the main plants that had been in the garden, the foundation and the frost and the water work to crumble foundational elements of the garden, and the forest comes back in, and eventually we're looking at an archaeological ruin. So if you think about this progress from the initial design stage all the way through the process, that's what we're going to watch happen, and how things have been born and reborn here at the Fells, and also how what the work that we're doing today has an impact on all of that, but also this continuity of care that needs to take place in order for something to really survive the test of time and remain meaningful. So first, I just want to take a quick look at some of these main eras of history here at this property, and we're going to do this kind of quickly. I can't do a talk now without really talking about the centuries of indigenous work that happened and livelihood that happened here on these grounds, and especially with a water like Lake Sunapee with such pure water, and the geology that was here. The work of the Abenakis is something that is better told in their voice and in their person than for me to relay that to you, but still a very important and critical era for any landscape that we're looking at here in North America. But it's not until, Newbury, they say, is settled in 1772, and in 1837, the Newbury Cut for the railroad comes through. Well, all of a sudden, the railroad is like a highway that makes it much easier to get up to Newport, up to Claremont, and some of the beautiful resources that are here in this area. And it happens at the same time that academics have the summer off. So you can work at Harvard, teach at Harvard, but then you've got a whole summer off, or you're a painter, or you're a writer, and you can leave for those nice times of the year and go someplace beautiful in order to be able to enjoy the summer season in a place outside of the stench of the city. And so John Hay comes up to this area by train and by steamboat. And if you think about the trip you took today, if you had to do that by train and steamboat, it'd be a very different experience coming to the Fells than it is by coming down by car. But this is what he's looking at. So in Newbury in 1850 and 1860, there's a census that's taken every 10 years by the federal government, and it asks you how many cows, how many sheep, how many horses, how many oxen, what kind of crops are you growing? So we get a picture of what these farms look like. And what you're seeing between 1850 and 1860 is that in fact, the amount of acreage per farm has almost doubled, but actually the production of those farms is almost the same. So you can see this decline in farming that everybody talks about as they're talking about this transition in New England from 90% open space to 90% forested again. So he's buying this. This is one of the images that is coming out of an illustrated brochure that's published by the railroad in 1897, saying, take the train, come on up to Sunapee, get on the steamboat, spend your summer here, spend your vacation here. And they're talking about long periods of time, not just a weekend. But this is the kind of landscape that they're promoting and they're marketing. And I think the trains here in New England were the first tourism marketing people that we had in the country. So John Hay starts to acquire this land, and he basically buys up 5 farms and then some other individual fields from other people. And they're a little hesitant to sell to him at first because they're not quite sure what he's going to do with all of this. But they come to like him, and he gives a lot of money, including getting a minister for the town church. So now he's not such a bad guy anymore, so we'll sell some more land to him. But in that period, this is just a very rude map. I'm sorry to say that it was mine, so I can call it a rude map. But it shows you these farms and the different farm buildings that are here that are being bought up. So the shore of Lake Sunapee is here on the left, and the top of Sunset Hill is on the right. And the blue line going through the middle is Route 103A. So you can see this distribution of these many acres of land that are being bought up by him. And again, these are beautiful views now from the Hay Library of the house that he built, but then also the scenery. This is a ruddy field with a lot of sheep in it and some trees. And that is really what he is coming here for, and that's what he's wanting, and that's what he's building and desiring. Now, if some of you know him well, John Hay, and the history here, you'll know about the 5 of Hearts. John and Clara Hay were part of a small social group in Washington, D.C. that included Henry and Marion Clover Adams and Clarence King. Clarence King was part of the National U.S. Geographic Service and got that moving, but he was also a writer. They were all writers. Henry Adams was a writer. He of course, came from the Adams family in Massachusetts, not the one on the movies. And Clover Adams was a very interesting character because she was a photographer, but suffered from depression at a time when women's depression was just not recognized. And so St. Gaudens created this incredibly gorgeous statue of a hooded figure that is the statue that is over her grave. And there's also a copy of it up at St. Gaudens at National Park Service site. So incredibly mysterious and very, very sad. But in 1886, when Hay is buying this land, the idea is that the Five of Hearts could come here for the summer, and they could walk the fields, they could go up to the top of Sunset Hill, and they could really enjoy this incredibly rugged, very rural landscape for themselves. And you can see Clarence King is a very good writer. He's effusing about how wonderful this is. I think he always lived on the back of John Hay's money, but he always was very, very good friends and had this vision of them living and camping here while John Hay built his house here. What's interesting is that once they build the house, they become celebrities here in Newbury. And so you get, even in this brochure for the steamboat, this description of the Fells and who's there and how famous he is and how important he is. And they had their own steamboat landing, which you can see in the little blue arrow that I put over here from the steamboat map of Lake Sunapee. He says he was so pleased with the air and the water and the scenery that he just never had found a more beautiful spot. And I think all of us would agree that that is still true today up here. But this is where he says, I had a farm in New Hampshire and desk room in the District of Columbia. It's interesting because the later years when he's here is probably one of the more tumultuous times in his political career because he's serving as Secretary of State, and then McKinley gets shot in Buffalo, Roosevelt comes in and takes over, and he's witnessing and part of this political turmoil that's happening in Washington, D.C. So you can see why this place was probably such a retreat for him in so many ways. This little cabin is an interesting part of the history here, and this was built, I'll show you where it's located on a map in a minute. But the belief is that it was probably a hunting cabin, that when they closed up the main house, they needed a smaller place if they wanted to come up here in the spring or the fall, or they wanted to go hunting. And so this cabin was built as part of that. It seems to be more than just a little summer house in the garden, and it had its own garden around it for a long time. And here, of course, is Teddy Roosevelt. Everybody's smoking cigars. He's planted his maple tree, and he's come up to see the Fells for the weekend. And this is the log cabin. So this is a very rustic little cabin, but you can see the charm, if this is a farm, of this being the place that you could go to that wasn't the main house, that was a place where you could really play. I've seen a number of these log cabins I did a lot of work at Fort Ticonderoga, and the family there built a log cabin in 1910, and they called it the YD house, which meant yes do, because the boys, the Pell boys, could just do whatever they wanted to do in that house. They didn't have to behave themselves like they did in the main house. And I kind of wonder if part of this was part of that history as well. But what's really interesting about log cabins that I find sort of fascinating is that in 1895, so Hay has built his house here, there was a man who really loved the history of Abraham Lincoln, and given that Hay wrote about Lincoln and did his biography, they bought this log cabin that they believed had parts of the logs of Lincoln's original birthplace cabin in Kentucky. And it was being taken down, so he took it down, it's all in pieces, and it gets put on a cart like this. And then it makes like a national tour, because nobody can figure out what to do with it once he's bought the cabin. So it goes to Nashville for the centennial celebration, it goes into storage, it comes out for the Buffalo exhibition where McKinley's been shot. Then it's shipped to his birthplace in Kentucky, they buy another piece of land, they want to put it back up again. And in fact, Roosevelt goes and lays the cornerstone at the frame that they put up to protect the log cabin there. But in the middle of all of this, probably about 1902, it was certainly there in that picture with Roosevelt, the log cabin gets built here as well. And there was a little bit of a log cabin mania here and around Lincoln's legacy. And so the Lincoln Penny gets built. And then finally in 1916, Lincoln Logs get created by Frank Lloyd Wright's son. But there is definitely a passion around log cabins, and nobody can tell, even to this day, the Park Service owns Lincoln's birthplace. They still can't tell if any of those logs are really from Lincoln's log cabin or not, but it's certainly a good story to be able to tell. And it places that little log cabin here in the context of all that was happening in nature. This is one of the last statements that John Hay makes, and he's writing here from the Fells, and he says, I've had many blessings and domestic happiness, and I've lived a good life. And you can see him resigning himself now to maybe his last days here at the Fells. But still a very rustic looking, very fancy farmhouse, but still very rustic looking. So Clarence inherits the property, and here he is on his horse. I love this picture because if you look at the outfits that everybody's wearing, it looks like it's one of those transitional moments in fashion where the older folks are wearing the old style clothes and the younger folks have younger things on. But here's the entry driveway, and you can see this is a 2-track road, a pretty important improved road for New Hampshire rather than a 1-track road. Here's the log cabin, here's Alice, here's grandson John Hay when he's only a couple of years old, right there on the walkway. And there's a lot of pictures during this period of them at the log cabin, and not so much in front of the main house. I want to talk a little bit about Alice, because Alice was born Alice Appleton. And her family is actually one of the properties that I still work on for the trustees of reservations. It's in Ipswich, Massachusetts. And it was founded in 1638. Her 7 times great-grandfather came to Ipswich from England, built this little house, and then 9 generations of Appletons lived on this same property. And it's 1,000 acres in Ipswich, Massachusetts, if you can imagine today. And her mother and father built this building, which is called the New House. It's no longer there, but it was built, architect designed by Herbert Little and Brown. Her mother came from the Berkshires. She came here to Ipswich. They built this very big house with an even bigger barn associated with it, but very much a colonial revival, end of the 19th century, sort of right after the Centennial in Philadelphia kind of a building, inspired a lot by these colonial motifs. And here is her grandfather's house, and that's still there. The L's have come off of it, but it is still present at Appleton Farms today. But you can see a much more pristine, more refined landscape here than what you see at the Fells. And this is her mother's garden, and this becomes important when I show you pictures of the rose terrace in just a little bit. Fountain in the middle of the garden, and all these roses. This garden is no longer here, and the house the family chose to take down in 1962 because they didn't want a big old white elephant of a house anymore. But the garden wall was still there, and we just had to take that down, the last piece of it, last year. And so here's the little cottage. This gets built here and I think they lived in this when they were renovating the main house. A lovely little place right down on the shore of the lake. This is a real treasure here that has yet to be developed and yet to have something happen to it, but I don't think you can build a house as close to the lake anymore as this building is, so it becomes very important just for the precedent that it sets. And in 1915, Alice and Clarence commissioned Prentice Sanger, who is a New York architect, to do a plan for the house and for the courtyard. And he's sort of landscape architect, I think. But the nice thing is that this is exactly what the property looked like in 1915. So you can see, if I find my pointer here, there it is right here. Here's the stables, their garage that we still have. Here's stables. Here's the house. This is the main house of the terrace. There's the lake down here. This is the L that you can see where we're sitting here. And then this is the old garden, but you can see this is the log cabin right here. And here's the little path and the little garden that was associated with the log cabin. This is the road that led down to the cottage. Now it goes this way and it goes around and goes out into the woods. But this walled garden is something that was here already. So this is not something, I thought at first this was a barn, and I don't think it was. I think it was intentionally built as a garden, probably by Alice and Clarence when they first came to inherit this property. And the appearance, this I love because I've done a lot of work in Newport, Rhode Island too, and they grew potatoes and squash all the time. When you want to put a lawn in 1915 and you have to get rid of all the rocks, then you cultivate some kind of a vegetable crop first and then eliminate all the rocks, and then you can go ahead and put the lawn in. It makes the ground a lot more even. So this is potatoes all around the main house. The main house has been renovated, and now they're putting potatoes all around it before they put the lawn in. And here, of course, is the pebble court, a very much fancier way to come into this house than what had been here before. And you can see these little nods to that house in Ipswich. So you can see where Alice is getting some of her ideas for renovating what's here. Here's John and Adele, the 2 children, 1919, but still a lot of open space and still a lot of rugged landscape all around, even with those refinements. What I want to do now is I'm just going to take a pause for a moment because Clarence and Alice have a long period here of history. And then in 1987, when Alice passes, the property goes to Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't care about a house, it doesn't care about a rock garden, it doesn't care about horticulture, it cares about species and saving species habitat. There were no endangered species here. So it's interesting that they inherit this incredibly beautiful property, and the Forest Service, and the Forest Society inherits half of it, Fish and Wildlife inherits the other half. And they basically say to the State Historic Preservation Office, we're gonna take the house down, we're gonna let the gardens go, there's no reason to have anything here, we'll just let it grow back up into trees, and it will just be a reservation. And so at that moment, there's a funny combination of people that come together for different reasons and not intentionally that end up having a lot of influence on what happens with this property. So here, of course, is John Hay, who is very concerned about what's going to happen to his mother's wishes. I think he would have been happy with this all going back to forest and just becoming habitat space, you know, because he's so interested in ecology. This is Al Caffin, who was the family estate gardener at the end, and I interviewed him. Unfortunately, that's me. Just ignore that. But this is Al, and he was a very prominent voice from a horticultural standpoint in helping us to understand that transition and how Mrs. Hay had done things because she outlived Clarence for so long, and what the ideas were and the concepts were for the gardens here. Dave Anderson, of course, was here because he was running the New Hampshire Forest Preservation Society for the Preservation of New Hampshire Forest property of the Fells. Frank Cabot had just started the Garden Conservancy right at the same time when this property went to Fish and Wildlife. And I went to a meeting because they were interested in what kind of projects they were going to start to do. So I brought this idea from the Fells because nobody knew how to save anything that was here. And he didn't know what to do with it because he thought there was some other organization that would save historic properties. And I said, no, Frank, unfortunately, there's nobody else that will save historic gardens. So he was agreed to get involved. And then, of course, Judd Gregg was governor, but he was ready to run for Senate in Washington. So he politically had a lot of reasons to try to move this property to the state of New Hampshire and then take credit for bringing this back to New Hampshire rather than Fish and Wildlife. And here's Stu Wallace, who was in the preservation office at the time. So lots of people in moments in their careers that are here and now understand and recognize that this property is something more than a Fish and Wildlife property, and what should it become and how should it change. And so here's just an example of what happens in the history of this property, and you can see so much activity happening in the late 80s and the early 90s, right after that moment when Alice Appleton passes. And you can see the kinds of reports that happen then as a result of all of that. And the Landscape Policies and Philosophy Statement is actually the fourth report that was written in order to be able to build out this reasoning for what had to happen. But I was telling Paige when I got here, without those players and without this kind of a history, we wouldn't have those reports, and we wouldn't have those intense conversations back and forth about what does this place mean? What does it mean for people? What does it mean intellectually for the preservation of a historic property? What does it mean from an emotional perspective for the reactions that you get when you come here? And those all had to be articulated and put into documents that could then argue for the preservation or the saving of these spaces in some form or another. And nobody knew where we were going to go in all of this. This was the first project, besides a completely finished garden, the Bancroft Garden in California, that the Garden Conservancy took on, and the first historic one that they took on. So it was a lot of work and a big deal, but it really did create what you're enjoying today as we went through all these transitions. I could do a whole other chart on what happens with nonprofits, you know, as they evolve and they move forward just like that. So now I want to quickly go through these different rooms and show you how this interaction between people and space really does reveal itself in each one of the rooms here. So we're going to look at some of the changes that Alice and Clarence made, and then we'll look at some of the changes that happened post the Hay family to understand where we are today. Let's start at the old garden, one of probably everybody's favorite spaces. And here's the plan for what the garden looked like in 1915. Important to remember that, in fact, we usually go into the old garden this way, from this end now, because there's a flower walkway down here that you're going to see in just a minute. So this is the way we tend to go in. But in fact, this was the intended way to go into the old garden with the log cabin right here. There were two entries here and here. This made the main room this big, long flower garden space here, and there was a maple tree in this spot right here. And then these little smaller rooms here, and then a little room with a fountain, and then you spilled back out into the woods again. So this was always a very valuable plan, and there's the log cabin over here with its little garden right there. This, in fact, is the main vista then for that. And look at all the flowers that are in this garden. You don't think about this being a walled flower garden, but that's really what it started as. And that's the view today, same view from historic. And here's another one. This goes back to the little entry where the little arbor is and the fencing. And this is all columbines. Can you imagine just a huge garden full of columbines in here? And here's what it looks like today. And the differences between then and now is this regrowth of the forest and the changes in the sun and the shade in here, and the change in the interest of gardening, because as more gardens got developed, like the rose terrace and then the rock garden, this became the old space. And one place that was sort of old news, and as the shade was coming in, it was harder to flower garden in here, so it turned into more of a ruin garden in many ways, but probably very evocative for that reason. Here's Alice with her new tables and chairs made out of concrete. Here they are sitting in the garden in that beautiful maple that used to be there in the little niche at the head of the garden. And here it is without the maple, but certainly still as evocative, later on. And here it is in 2023. This was the last visit that I made here. But you can see this shift, and yet it's still beautiful and evocative. And what's changed here is that frosting layer. The frosting has completely changed to a new kind of a frosting. And the trees, the foundational pieces, all of those beautiful walls are still there and will be there even if this went totally back into forest. When we did the study for this garden, we were actually looking at the seedling trees that lived outside of the wall, so we could understand what kind of a forest was going to come up after the forest that was there at the moment in 2007, so that we could see whether we had to curate what the woods looked like around this garden so that we could keep that middle layer open and get that raking light through here that made it so beautiful. This is a wonderful painting by Helen Nicolay, who was a friend of the Hayes. And you can see, I don't know whether this is imaginative or whether this was real, but she moved that arbor into the middle of the garden, and here's the view in 2023 of the same space. The family went to Williamsburg, and just like everybody that goes to Williamsburg, you have to put boxwood in your garden, so they created little boxwood parterres here, just so that it can look a little bit more like Williamsburg and an old American garden in that way. This is 2005, so the garden really had started to decline, and it started to change, and it had not had a little rejuvenation in a long period of time. So when Jeff Good was here, we did some tree cutting. He did all of this incredible work to try to restore the garden back to what it had looked like in those historic photographs. And you can see more light coming into the garden in these pictures. And there's the boxwood hedge back again. And the restoration as close as possible, given the light situations, to the garden in the Hayes time. What's interesting for me is that I went on another space. I had to go look at another garden down in Beverly, Massachusetts, and it was about to be lost. And I walked in, and this is what I saw. And I thought, oh my God, this is the same garden as what is up at the Hay Estate. I don't understand. They also don't know who designed this garden space for them, but it has so many similarities. And this is Mr. and Mrs. Quincy Adams Shaw. So I don't know whether some of the Adams family stayed friends with each other into that next generation, why their garden looks so similar to the one here at the Hay Estate, but this certainly is an interesting juxtaposition of two gardens. And you could almost say that this is probably, the garden up here. This is from Gardens of Colony and State, a very important garden book with lots of beautiful garden photographs from New England here. This is the 1925 version. There was one earlier. But still, it's interesting to me that we can't figure out who helped to design those garden spaces, and yet they worked in two places at the same time. This is one of my favorite pictures of the walled garden because of that cathedral-like view of the light as it rakes across the garden. And it shows you the importance of that middle space when the sun is starting to set and what it does for the feel of the garden and the cathedral-like feeling being in the trees. I mentioned the flower walk to the brick steps, and you can take a walk and find these brick steps still. They kind of enter into the woodland. This had been a huge long flower border in 1924-25 when the garden itself was full of flowers. This is what it looked like coming the 1930s. Again, the area is shifting to the rose garden and the rose terrace, so this has been given up. And now that it's been replanted with rhododendron, and you can see again the new rhododendron walk going in there. And then in the 1950s, they kept the rhododendrons fairly low. And then this is what it looks like today. So you can see that change in the growth of the plant material and the way that the space itself has changed over time. Here's the rose terrace. Again, if you think of this picture and you think about those pictures of Alice's mother's garden back in Ipswich, you can see where some of these nods to her past come from. Full of beautiful roses and a space where she really intended everybody to live, to come off of the terrace, to be in the rose garden. Roses were always considered to be her thing. Clarence had the rock garden, she had the rose garden, and this was really her space. And here she is in the garden in the 1950s, and these beautiful long borders. And of course, roses are probably one of the first things to disappear because they take so much work. And in my interview with the state gardener, he said they had to replace at least 25 to 50 roses every single year because they just didn't like the New Hampshire winters here. So definitely an annual for New Hampshire, for sure. And of course, here it is in 1993. All of that frosting, that layer of roses had all disappeared, but the foundational pieces of the rose terrace were still here, and that incredibly beautiful fountain. My kids were really little, and because I had to come here a lot, they loved to follow the pollywogs from this urn all the way down into the rock garden and then down into the pool in the rock garden and see where they went to. So very much a fun thing for the kids to be able to do. This perennial border that you see here went through a similar life. So when I talk about this frosting layer in the ephemeral part of perennial gardens, this is what I mean. So here's a beautiful, very full, very wide border in the 1927, 1930. And I love the furniture on the porch too. This is what it looked like in 1950, about the same time as that picture of the rose terrace. Big garden, big garden. And I think this is all alyssum that's along the edge of the garden bed itself. And then this is what it looked like in 1993. So again, all of those perennials need a gardener to be able to take care of them. And even though Al was here, he was 79 and very, very elderly and didn't have the money to put into all of this. So those pots of agapanthus along the wall itself were really what carried this space. Nevertheless beautiful. The wall just comes shining through more when the perennials are gone. And here, of course, is the border in 2009. This border changes with every horticulturist that's here. And that's part of the intention of what makes this place so alive and so thriving and so dynamic. Every horticulturist wants to be able to have their say in some statements in horticulture, you know, and this gives them the opportunity to do that for sure. And then, of course, the rock garden or the alpine garden. This starts in 1929, and it is a small space. It's built in 3 parts as you go down the hill. Here's the fish pond getting built in 1931, and you will all probably know that the stream was rediverted to go up into that urn in the rose garden, then went underground, and then comes out at the top of the rock garden, and then comes down and fills this stream, goes down through the fern glen that he bought from the flower show in about 1932, and then down into the woodland, and then it just disperses back into the woods before it goes down to the lake. So a rediversion of nature to be able to create the spine for this whole designed garden space. The writings that we have of Clarence Hay, he did 2 articles about this garden and about what it was like to garden here in the north. My favorite one is this one in 1962 when he talks about gardening with granite in the north. And he talks about how difficult it is, but he also talks about his passion for this rock garden because he's very proud. And every rock gardener that I know feels this exact same way, that if I can get a plant to grow in rock, I can have it grow any place. So very, very proud of this garden and what he did. And you can see the difference here at the bottom, how open the bottom of the garden was. Now the woods have grown in at the space of the garden there. Again, this is what it looked like in 1992. A lot of invasives had started to come in, and the more tender of those alpine plants had disappeared. And the hardiest ones had survived for sure. So there was still the feeling that this was a really wonderful rock garden, but definitely lost a lot of the diversity in the rock garden plants that were on Clarence's list that we have. With the horticulturists coming in and the volunteers coming in, you begin to see, you know, the garden coming back to life again. And again, it shifts with the season, it changes with the times, it changes with the available staff that's here. I meant to say, when I showed you all those faces of people, if I had probably 6 slides for the number of volunteers that have worked passionately, both for this organization as well as in the gardens here, that is really what has kept this place alive and moving and going so strongly, is the volunteer forces that have cared so much about it. And you can see, based on the season and based on the time of the year, here's where all the heather has started to come back in again, which Clarence Hay had predicted was going to happen. And so it's time again for something to happen. Back in 2010, we had replanted all of the heather beds at the top of the hill here, and they make a spectacular display when you're looking down at that view of the lake. But they also don't love New Hampshire winters, so they are also pretty ephemeral when it comes to how happy they are here. And then I just wanted to show you this space. When this organization began and the Garden Conservancy was here, there was 0 money. There was 0 money. There was no director, there was no staff. And the way to be able to start to build some kind of an opportunity to even pay for the horticulturist that was here was to have a plant sale. So there was some very, very gifted volunteers, Ann Leffler among them, who could propagate almost anything out of the gardens here. And if you could propagate, you didn't have to buy the plants in for the plant sale, you could just propagate what you already had. So she used this space inside what was called the dog yard as the nursery space, and had some shady spaces as well. Propagated a lot, and the plant sale that everybody remembers was really born and bred out of this volunteer initiative to try to make enough money to be able to pay for the gardeners. The house was closed, so there was no reason to pay for heat in the house. It was mostly to pay for the gardeners and the staffing that was needed in the garden, and no executive director, so totally volunteer run all the way through. This is an incredibly beautiful space and a wonderful addition. And again, I feel like this part of the property is the service support part of the property. And so this building is beautifully placed in a place where the actual service side of the property takes place. And this really is in service to the preservation of the rest of the property here. And it's a beautifully done space. And I took pictures of this, and I've been showing this with the trustees because I love this balance of sort of a frame tent, but with an actual small building attached to it that could be year round. A beautiful example of how to be able to creatively use some of these spaces for the winters that we have. And here's what Clarence said about this garden. And here again is where we come full circle to this idea about the woods taking over the garden. And he thinks about what it would be like if this place was abandoned. So they, in real time, were thinking about what happens as this property fades away and the woods come in and they take everything over here again. But it is to all of your credit that this has not yet happened, that this is really still a place that is cultivated and gardened and tended and cared for and cared a lot about, and is incredibly meaningful to an awful lot of people that come here. So this incidental interaction between many different people, from private site to public site, to volunteer run, to professionally run, to that combination that is so genius and so magic in so many of these nonprofit sites, is still very alive and very viable and very important. And I only hope that that energy can keep going, because it is really another part of this place that makes it so special. You can come here and walk by yourself, you can come to an event here, you can come here with a group of people and help to garden or help to market or help to tend the business of the property and build a social life here. And that is exactly what John Hay had intended to do with the Five of Hearts way back in 1886. And so thank goodness that we've got this interaction between people and place that makes this place so special. So I really thank you very much for letting me come and talk about all of this today. It's been a place near and dear to my heart since 1988, and I'm glad to be able to see it evolve and see it stay so strong and so vibrant and so alive for so many. And I'm glad to see some friends here that I haven't seen in a long time, like Karen. So great to be able to be here again. And I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions or any thoughts or anything that you'd like to share with everybody now. Don't be chicken. Yes.
Did you get a lot of your information from Brown University?
I got my information from John Hay, from Al Cathan, and I just gave Fritz an interview that I did with Al in 1991 that was talking about the horticulture here and the gardening here and his memories of Mrs. Hay especially. From Brown University and all the collections that are down there, which are really, really great. And from the Hay family collections, the scrapbooks and so forth that were down at the cottage that John Hay still had at the time. So those photos are all part of that archive that's so rich that documents what's here. Mm-hmm.
Two quick questions. There's a Catherine Gardens in Newport. I assume they're related in some form of fashion?
Absolutely right. Mrs. Hay had lost her estate gardener, and I can't remember in the interview Al says, but he either died or he didn't want to garden anymore. I think she could be a very finicky boss. And so there was some turnover for a little bit, and she ended up at Catherine Gardens and said to Al's brother, do you know anybody that is a good horticulturist that could come and work for me at this estate? And Al had just left another client and was looking for something to do. So he came over and worked for a little bit. She tested him out first to see if she liked him. And then he didn't have a place to live. And so he said to her, you know, I need to find a place to live for the winter. And she said, well, I have a caretaker's house. So he lived right here on 103A. And he said, well, I can't just take that for free. I need to have a business arrangement. So he ended up working out a salary from her, and then he would pay her for his house to stay here. But they ended up, I think, becoming quite fond of each other, and it's very sweet to hear him talk about this relationship. He also had a series of younger, mostly boys, that worked for him, that were part of the back labor because he was getting older. But yes, it's all the same family, all the same family.
Another quick question. Back in the 20s, this is sort of like a logistics question.
Yeah.
All these beautiful flowers, where the heck did they get them? And, how do they get here? I mean, it's not as if they're going to New London to Spring Ledge and,
Those trains were mighty and strong, I have to say. You think about this place being so rural, but if you look at a train network here in New Hampshire, you could literally put something on the train in New York City and it could be up here by the end of the day if you were careful. And so our perception about that transportation and that work, it wasn't mail order, that's for sure. It didn't come by mail order, but it definitely was a network of horticultural connections. And her mother had them. They went to New York for the winter time as well. And I think horticulturist to horticulturist, they shared a lot, but this garden here with all of her roses and everything else, she was buying from Boston and from New York, and they were coming by train and coming up here. Al said when he first came in to take care of the garden, the house was closed and Mrs. Hay wasn't here, and he was very concerned. He didn't want to drive in and he didn't want to open any doors and even find a wheelbarrow. So he put everything in big gunny sacks when he was weeding and dragged them all up to the top of the hill and then drove them away because he didn't know what to do with all the weeds and so forth that he had here until Mrs. Hay came and explained to him how the property could work from a service standpoint, in the back.